Hello and welcome to the Paul Garcia Show, where I have conversations with the remarkable people from the central Illinois area. Today I'm talking with the police chief of the Pontiac, Illinois Police Department, Jim Woolford. This is going to be a great conversation and I can't wait to share it with you. But before we begin, I'd like to give a quick shout out to a local small business that we all know and love, Fairbury Furniture, located in downtown Fairbury. Look down. What are you sitting on? Is it from Fairbury Furniture? If it's not, you should have a serious talk with yourself, because if you're not getting your furniture from Fairbury Furniture, then you're missing out on some great prices, quality furniture, exceptional service, and high-end style. So ditch your decades-old furniture and pick up something awesome from Fairbury Furniture. All right, without any further ado, here's my conversation with Pontiac's Police Chief, Jim Woolford. Jim Woolford, thank you very much for coming on to the show.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
It is my pleasure. So you've been involved in law enforcement for a little over 2 decades now, if I understand correctly. You've been a patrolman, a sergeant, a commander, and in 2012 you became the chief of police for the Pontiac Police Department. I just want to know, what got you interested in this profession in the first place? Because, I mean, it's not glamorous, it's dangerous, and it's a lot of work.
Yeah, so probably as a young guy, the difficult parts of the job do seem glamorous. You know, I mean, to make arrests and that kind of thing, that was helpful, I think, in helping me decide to want to choose this field. The action, the being outside all the time, not being tied down into an office. You know, I think as a young person, I was really always interested in having a job that I had some freedom and mobility in. And so really, it all started in high school. I have brothers that are older than me, and my oldest brother, Dave, he left for the military 2 years before I graduated high school. And growing up, I didn't necessarily have the funding to pay for college and that kind of thing. So the military was a good option. And it was something that I had decided that I was going to do just like my brother. And when he joined, he became an MP.
What is an MP?
It's the military police.
Okay.
So me, being the younger brother, followed in his footsteps, and I joined the Army and became a military police officer as well. So in doing that job, I mean, the mission really of the military police and civilian law enforcement, there's some similarities, but there's a lot of differences. And I really thought that my life was going to be full-time military until I retired. But it didn't quite work out that way. Young people are sometimes short-sighted. And so I did 4 years in the Army. I first went to Korea. Really, our main mission was, if war broke out, we were a detachment. We were supposed to go back to Seoul and protect Yongsan, which is the main military base in Seoul. After that, I went to Fort Meade, Maryland, and that's near D.C., so it was more interesting there. We had a lot more police type work we did on the post, and then our training missions were interesting. So I enjoyed the military, and I wanted to stay. But while I was at Fort Meade is when Desert Storm began. So my unit got deployed to Desert Storm. I sometimes talk about that as though everybody knows everything about it, but 1990 was quite a long time ago. So we were supposed to move on the western side of Iraq and drive their forces toward the middle of the whole military system to circle them, I guess you would say. So
wow, that's kind of that's an important job.
It was. Well, my job as an MP, we were really to gather the prisoners of war. That was what our mission was. The tanks would come through, blow stuff up, people would surrender, and then we would detain them, and then transport companies would come in and they would carry them back to Saudi Arabia to our prisoner of war camps. So
wow. So
yeah.
Did you literally have your hands on some of the people that you were making prisoners of war?
Yeah, so we that war was a 100-day war, and the United States and its coalition easily overwhelmed Iraq. Mm-hmm. And so many of their soldiers didn't have the right equipment. You know, a lot of their weapons were rusted shut. Many of them were just taken from their houses and put out in and told that they were fighting Iran, and had no idea that the United States was even involved in this. So the U.S. Army had done campaigns of dropping leaflets, surrender leaflets, and I mean, people were coming in hundreds with these leaflets to surrender to us. So we were definitely busy with prisoners of war. And to be honest with you, that kind of changed my whole philosophy of life. I mean, I think I saw a side of being human that you might not necessarily take as a young person. You know, the way some of these Iraqi troops, if you called them troops, the condition that they were in was pretty deplorable. So I think they got treated better as being prisoners of war than they did, you know, as troops in the Iraqi army. So afterwards, at that time, there then became a big push to reduce forces, and there was a lot of base closures, and some of the bases around me were looking like they might shut down. And I was at that point an E4, which was a specialist, and I was just slated to go to PLDC, which is a leadership course, to become a corporal. To me, it just looked like things might not be looking good for a career in the Army, because there was not going to be a lot of opportunities. So I decided to end my tour and then go back to school and then maybe look into civilian law enforcement. So that is kind of how that kind of took place. So I got out, went to IVCC for a couple years, was almost done, and I had applied here at Pontiac PD, first place I ever applied, and they hired me. So I thought, well, that's the reason I'm going to school, so why finish this? So I left, and I decided to take up this job.
Since your career began here in the late 90s, how has the public's attitude towards law enforcement as a whole, specifically law enforcement in the Pontiac area, how has it evolved and changed, do you think, if at all? Because I know the mass media, how it says things are changing and how ideas are changing might be different from how they're actually changing in reality. So I'd like to go straight to you and get your honest opinion on that.
Yeah, honestly, you know, that's a topic that in law enforcement we put a lot of thought into. And as the chief here, looking back at my career and how our relationship with the public has changed, I can't honestly say I think it's changed much in this community. There's always been large support for law enforcement here. I think what has changed are, like you said, media constructs. During 9/11, you know, there was a big push, pro-police push, and that was, I think, a lot of media related as well. But what it did is there was maybe more open people saying, hey, thanks for your service kind of a thing. And while we appreciate that, I think that sentiment has always been here. And we're creatures of habit. Like, you wouldn't walk around in your small community and say, thanks for your service to a guy that you know as your kid's softball coach or, you know, a baseball coach. You don't have to say that every time because you're going to see him 100 times.
Yeah.
So I think we've always enjoyed strong support. And I think if you looked at research polls, you're not going to find a lot of big fluctuations in support with the police. I think where the biggest issue in that lies is with the minority communities and how they've perceived the police and how they perceived their interactions with the police. To be true and frank, Pontiac is not the biggest diverse community. While if you looked at, I guess, a demographics website and saw what our population breakdown is, I think the Department of Corrections enhances, you know, makes it appear as though we have a larger minority population, and we do. While they are currently residents in the city, they're not out roaming about in the streets having interactions with us. And so we don't have a large minority population, but we also don't have issues like a larger city has to where they come up. I mean, it's a small community, so whether you are a migrant worker or you've grown up and you're an African American here. We kind of all just are citizens of Pontiac, and that's how we've always tried to look at things and do it. So I haven't seen a big change in how the public has treated us. I just think it's more of a media construct than it is a reality.
Yeah, it's at least boosted by the media, this notion that there is racism within law enforcement culture. And it's really interesting to me because it kind of it's not parallel with the data. And that might be insensitive of me to say. But this show is sponsored by Popejoy Plumbing, Heating, Electric, and Geothermal. As you can tell by that long name, Popejoy offers a full array of services that ensure that your home's machinery will continue to operate at peak performance for many years to come. The Popejoy name has been serving commercial and residential customers throughout central Illinois since 1984. At Popejoy, their elite-level team works hard to ensure that your homes and businesses remain comfortable, healthy, and energy efficient all year round. No matter what service you're requesting, you can rest assured that every Popejoy service technician is properly trained and certified. Their comfort advisors and their technicians participate in ongoing factory-sponsored training classes all the time, so they understand all the latest installation and repair techniques. So for top-quality plumbing, heating, electric, and geothermal services, call Popejoy at 815-496-5181. Their lines are open 24/7 because they know emergencies don't just happen during regular business hours. Call Popejoy, where a flush always beats a full house. Do you think that attitudes towards law enforcement have largely changed in larger cities? You think that's the case?
I'm not sure if they've changed. I think that voices have become stronger in minority communities. And I think, I think my biggest worry about the movements that we're looking at and defund policing ideas and all that stuff,
right.
I think it all kind of is misguided in the fact that, and if law enforcement has a role to play in it, then they should play the right role. But I think rather than looking at it from a political perspective, and it's easier, again, like I said, in a smaller community like this, that to look at each other as, look, we're all human beings on this planet, and we all need to be treated as such. And so not all of us grew up the same way. Not all of us had the same opportunities, and not all of us had the same upbringing. So we all come from different places in life. And so to view someone else, you have to realize that I'm viewing you with my lens of what I have lived and what I have done. And so I might not know what your lens is, but if I treat you like a human being with dignity and respect, it really isn't going to make a whole lot of a difference. You either, in my profession, if we're dealing with an individual, and this is what I try to relate to the officers, that it doesn't matter what our personal feelings are. If you committed an offense, then that has to be addressed, and there's a right way for that to happen, and it's through the court system. I mean, weren't designated to be judge and jury. We were designated to determine if there's probable cause to make an arrest, or if we're doing a community caretaking function of how can we be of assistance. And we have been given discretionary powers. And that is where I think some officers that I suppose if they're going to do the wrong things, that's where that falls in, is you have a discretion to arrest or to not arrest, and how that's applied can make a difference in how you're perceived by, and hopefully the public, I guess it goes with everything else, that one officer doesn't define an entire agency. But in perception, the reality is that in some cases it does. And so if a minority or if an individual is treated unfairly by an officer who had poor intentions, it's going to reflect negatively on the city and on the entire police department. And it may not be the reality of the circumstance. It may be an officer who, in a moment, came from a call that created some emotional stress, or is having trouble at home, or maybe he's just a bad person for whatever reason. That, I think the key is for us begins with the hiring process of, doing the due diligence to hire the right people, and making sure that throughout their career we're able to keep track on how they're doing and making sure that they have those skills to maintain the stress, to have good outlets, and to do all those things that help keep them mentally and physically strong to do some pretty demanding and difficult work.
Mm-hmm. I want to go to what you said about one police officer can kind of make a whole department look bad, especially these days when everyone has video cameras on their phones. And I mean, arrests are getting recorded like crazy. If there does happen to be one incident where a police officer acts poorly and makes a bad decision, whatever, if the chances are it's going to be caught on film, and then it's going to be spread throughout the internet, you know, and be viewed millions of times. So it seems like this one incident has actually happened a million times, you know. So it kind of gives a false idea to the people who view those videos about just how often this truly happens. You know, one bad apple in 1,000 might look like 1,000 bad apples in 1,000, you know, and right. I just think that's interesting.
Yeah, and I think those bad apples are things that we should stand up and take notice to and do the right things. And so, you know, Illinois just passed some pretty sweeping reform legislation.
Yes.
And the legislative caucus cited repeatedly issues that have happened throughout the nation, not in Illinois. And so exactly what you said, that, you know, cases in Louisville, Kentucky, Minneapolis, they are all defining what is going on in Illinois when those really aren't Illinois problems. Mm-hmm. And I think Illinois has done a pretty good job. And so, you know, there are some cases that have made national attention in Chicago, but Chicago is a city of millions of people with 13,000 plus police officers. So, the potential there for having a negative incident is a lot greater than it is in the city of Pontiac. Yeah. So, you know, but it is our job as government officials to recognize where we are and where we work, and to recognize that we are, to many people, the Constitution. Mm-hmm. So it's a duty to uphold that, take it serious, and to understand what people's rights are, and to be able to apply that in the field. Man, and we're human beings, so we're going to make mistakes, and hopefully those mistakes aren't anything that's going to cost someone their lives. Maybe an inconvenience at some times, and maybe some evidence gets thrown out in a court case, and maybe hopefully that's the worst case scenario. So, but there are systems in place that address, you know, those things. So the police reform bill that was passed has gotten a lot of negative attention, and it's gotten a lot of positive attention depending on what side you're on. Mm-hmm. In looking at it, I think there's plenty of things that need to be retooled and maybe redefined. But all in all, right now, law enforcement isn't opposed to reform and doing the right things. I think what law enforcement is opposed to is trying to criminalize mistakes. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, every profession, human beings make mistakes, and I don't think you can put a police officer in a position that when he makes a mistake, that officer's facing jail time. Mm-hmm. You're not going to be able to recruit people to want to do the job if that's the case.
Right. Of course, and of course, it's also depending on the mistake and the severity of it and things like that. But what you just said, I think that was beautifully put, and I also think it transitions very well to this next thing I want to talk about, and that's that. On Monday, February 22nd, Governor J.B. Pritzker passed House Bill 3653. This show is sponsored by Forest Edge Tree Service. The winter has been catastrophic on our trees, and it's led to tons of damage. Ice, snow, and strong winds lead to downed trees, limbs, and power lines, causing massive damage to your homes, cars, and properties. Face it, your yard is no place for looming, dead, and damaged trees. It's just a matter of time before one comes down, whether by your choice or not. This is why you need to hire the excellent services of Forest Edge Tree Service. No job is too complicated for these folks, and they even offer emergency services. So if you have trees or tree stumps that you want gone, give Joe Rudin at Forest Edge Tree Service a call or text at 815-615-3037 to get a free quote today. today. Forest Edge Tree Service is fully insured and staffed with trained professionals who use cutting-edge equipment to get the job done right. Make your property safe and beautiful with a tree service that you can trust. These pros take pride in their attention to detail and in their cleanup and in their relationships with their customers, which is why they are Livingston County's premier tree service provider. Keep your family, pets, vehicles, and neighbors safe by being proactive with your land. It'll save you money and help you to avoid all the headaches of unplanned downed trees. Be a responsible adult and call or text Joe Rudin with Forest Edge Tree Service at 815-615-3037 to schedule your free quote today. And let them know that the Paul Garcia Show sent you. The bill abolishes cash bail, gives the state more power in the hiring of law enforcement. It gives the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board more freedom and authority to decertify officers for unlawful or unethical conduct, and it also makes body cams mandatory for all law enforcement agencies statewide. These all among other things. And the bill is extremely controversial and reportedly has gained not a lot of support from those in law enforcement. And I just want to get your thoughts on that, because I mean that was yesterday. We're filming right now on Tuesday.
Yeah.
So any thoughts on that bill?
A lot of thoughts on that bill. There's a lot of problematic areas in that bill. I think one of the biggest to initially point out is the way that bill was passed.
Right.
It was passed in the cover of darkness.
It was passed
3
like
o'clock
after midnight.
It was introduced at 3 o'clock in the morning, and by 4:30 it was passed. So
Incredible.
There's a coalition of the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police, the Illinois Sheriff's Association, and the Fraternal Order of Police, and the Chicago Police FOP Lodge. So they had been meeting with the Attorney General on reforms, and one of those was the certification process. And there was discussion on whether police should be licensed or certified, because law enforcement is all for getting rid of bad cops.
Right.
So there are some processes in place that were making that a little more difficult. Union rights, due process.
Are police departments unions? Is that correct?
Many of them are. So ours is.
Okay.
Yeah. So most, I think, would say their officers are union employees. But in some of the processes of doing administrative hearings and trying to get rid of bad officers. I mean, it's a different world in law enforcement. So if I have an officer who's doing corrupt things, sometimes just a regular discipline of suspension may not be enough, but it's made more difficult through an arbitration process where an arbitrator may say, oh, yeah, well, if they hadn't been in trouble a whole lot, and that maybe they should be suspended. But there are some offenses that should be immediately terminated. That the city loses public trust when officers do corrupt acts,
and they don't get fired.
And they're still, and then the public sees that same officer working a month later or whatever the case is.
So did you say that police unions can be kind of problematic in expelling bad officers? Is that correct?
Well,
and if so, how so?
Yeah. So I say the term problematic, but a union has its duty to look after the employee and make sure that they're being treated fairly by the workplace. So they're going to support an officer and probably try and keep his job. Not many of the unions are going to come to the law enforcement and say, hey, fire this guy. Now, there are times when a union would, like if it's just an outright corruption, a union isn't going to be able to protect that, nor would they want to. But law enforcement has some unique aspects to it where we're accountable for things that we do when we're not working. So, for example, if I'm out and I become drunk and drive and I get into a crash and I injure someone, as a chief of police, that's going to reflect pretty negatively on my city. As a patrol officer, that's going to reflect pretty negatively on the city. Although you weren't on duty when that happened, it's going to affect the trust that the public is going to have when the next day you're working, whenever. So in their efforts to give an officer due process, it does, in some circumstances, undermine a city's effort in protecting the public trust that the city has. So City like us, we don't really have, we're small, so we're able to know each other and know the officers here know what the stakes are for what they're doing on and off duty, and there isn't much of that going on here. So I can't say we've been in a position where we have criminal officers working. So
Right.
But there are some that I think based on issues with how maybe a hearing was conducted, that bad apples have been able to keep their job. In some places. So I think that is problematic. And maybe it's not a union per se and a systematic fault, whether it's an arbitration fault or a process fault. So
what do you think about police training? Do you think that it could stand to be a little more rigorous in that, the education and the physical training maybe? I've always thought, I'm definitely biased because I'm a lifelong wrestler, I thought it would be useful for police officers to have some training in something like jiu-jitsu or wrestling for takedowns, submissions, restraining, things like that aren't lethal, That's just my opinion. What do you think, though, about training? Is it sufficient as it is, or could it stand to be made better?
So our officers receive a lot of training, and some of the things that they're asking us to be trained in, I guess it's going to depend on how the administration of that is done. Like all professions, there's good training and there's bad training. Now, there isn't a mandatory defensive tactics type of course, but we all get it at the academy. And we have what are called mobile training units, which are the Illinois Training and Standards Board put on for in-service training for people who are already officers that are out of the academy. Ours is based at Heartland Community College. And so as being a member of that, we're able to go to all kinds of training without additional cost other than the fee that we pay to the MTU each year. So, and that covers everything from interviews, defensive tactics, pressure points, chemical weapons, you name it. There's everything, firearms instructors, all the things that we do, there's training available for, and our officers routinely get that training. So if an agency is struggling getting their training, sometimes that happens due to the agency size and the availability of, if someone is in training, then they're not working on the street. So covering costs of overtime for them to go there. We've just established here at Pontiac a culture that training is important. And so we've been able to maintain. There's a list on my wall, if you can see over here. This is a list of trainings that are required every year, every 2 years, every 3 years, every 4 years. And so we meet all those. And the Training and Standards Board has a website that you can go and look at and see where your officers are in that. But in addition to those, the agency requires, you name it, more training than that. We have some mandatory federal stuff like hazardous materials, bloodborne pathogens. But then in-house, we require other things like the defensive tactics, firearms qualifications. The state requires that a police officer qualifies once a year. We require that they qualify 3 times a year. And then in addition to that, shooting at night and then doing scenarios. And we have like an airsoft course that we go through and shoot, don't shoot scenarios. And,
is that this? So you said this department does those things?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. So they go above and beyond here.
Oh,
that's very
much,
cool.
Yeah. So
that's commendable.
There's all kinds of training and use of force and legal updates and you name it that our officers go through. I mean, you have to stay abreast of that. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to effectively do your job out on the street.
Is there any kind of like annual physical examination that officers have to go through? Because not that I really see many of them, but I want to see, I've seen it before, like an overweight, extremely overweight cop, who could not run a mile in under 10 minutes, like no chance. Is there any kind of annual test that just makes sure that you're in good enough shape to be a cop, or is there no such thing? Are cops able to get big and fat and out of shape? And the reason I ask that is because if there's an out of shape cop, severely out of shape, I feel as though they're going to be more likely to use other means of self-defense or other means of restraint. Maybe they're going to be more trigger happy or likely to, do something unethical, I guess.
Right.
This show is sponsored by Greg Kurtenbach State Farm offices in Fairbury and Gibson City, Illinois. When looking for insurance, things like clarity, simplicity, solid ratings, and great prices should be at the top of your priorities. Well, Greg Kurtenbach State Farm offices excel on all fronts. Google Greg Kurtenbach State Farm office in Fairbury and just look at his ratings. 56 reviews, all 5 stars. Incredible. You don't get that kind of reputation for just being okay. I recently met with Greg at his Fairbury location and was blown away by how easily he could explain the ins and outs of health and life insurance to me. You have heard that the task of genius is to make simple the complex, and well, Greg Kurtenbach and his team are geniuses, and you'd be a genius too if you just gave his office a call, and they'll give you a free quote right then and there. Oh, and if you didn't know, Greg is a celebrity. In addition to his face and mustache being on a massive billboard on the west end of Fairbury, you've probably seen his State Farm commercial that he starred in from just a few years back. This office is incredible, and there's plenty of reasons why so many people from the area are calling them up, getting free quotes, and proudly making Greg Kurtenbach their new insurance agent. For quality insurance and the impeccable customer service that you deserve, call Greg Kurtenbach's State Farm office in Fairbury at 815-692-3673 or in Gibson City at 217-784-8343. And be sure to tell him that the Paul Garcia Show sent you.
In Illinois, there is nothing that mandates an annual physical agility test or anything like that. When you're hired, there's what they call the power test, and that's a state standard that you do have to pass this test to go to an academy. It measures physical strength, cardio endurance. So it's a bench press, a sit and a reach, a 1.5 mile run, sit-ups. So you have to do that once. And after that, you're completely right that there is nothing that would prevent an officer from becoming obese and becoming a physical problem, incapable of doing the job. Now, if you're not capable of doing the job, then most law enforcement agencies would be able to identify that officer as being unfit for duty and take some actions there. But I think most officers support some sort of a annual physical training, something. But as you can imagine, because it's not mandatory, then it becomes a mandatory subject of bargaining. And so in the union contracts, well, the officers are going to want to get paid to do it, or there'll be some sort of a monetary incentive for it. And the cities don't necessarily have to do it, so why spend money if you don't have to?
Of course, right. Yeah, it's only normal.
But it's to the detriment of the city as a whole that if an officer's not willing to, and I think that's a dual-sided coin. If an officer's not willing to take care of themselves physically, is the city going to have a huge effect by saying you have to at least pass this test every year? And then what happens if you don't pass the test? How long are you given to be able to pass the test? Right. So there's a whole, if you can see, there's a whole systematic problem involved in making that mandatory that I don't think it's unworkable. I think there are some agencies and maybe some non-home rule agencies who've done it, and there are wellness programs out there that recognize the importance of physical and mental well-being of police officers. So it can be done. The state just doesn't mandate it.
I'm probably going to sound like a moron here because I don't know. I'm really not an expert on this type of thing. But I've always thought that it wouldn't be a bad idea to raise the rewards. How do I say this? To pay officers more but require harsher training. The annual physical training, go deeper into the education that is required to become a cop, things like that. Pay them more, make training tougher and more beneficial for when they do become a cop. What do you think of that? And do you have any personal ideas of how to improve law enforcement as a whole?
So I think we have some fantastic officers.
No doubt about it. That's true. That's true.
I don't think that the city of Pontiac falls into the category of having officers that need to be better educated, better trained, and better able to do their jobs. Do I think they should be paid more? Absolutely. That's
it's an
problem.
Important job. Jeez.
It's a problem in of itself. I mean, officers are asked to do today. They are asked to do so much more with so much less. They're under scrutiny more. They're required to be mental health experts. They're required to be addiction experts.
Goodness, an awful lot is expected of them for the amount of money that they're receiving as pay.
Right. And so,
Sheesh.
And we talk about in some of these things, some of the defund the police strategies.
Yeah.
They call them not necessarily defund the police, but reallocate and put money toward drug rehab and mental health.
Civil services or something
Sure.
like that?
Social services.
Social services, yes.
And law enforcement, of course, supports that, but there's a reason why law enforcement has been the ones that are going to mental health crisis calls. If it wasn't potentially a violent and dangerous issue, then you would have mental health experts doing home visits to these people when they're experiencing crisis. But the reality is it's gotten to this point because there have been tragedies that have happened, and it's dangerous to go to somebody who's having maybe a psychotic episode, and you're there to try and talk them down with no means of defending yourself and becoming a victim of a violent crime yourself. So law enforcement is maybe, of course, I think we recognize that we're not the best tool for mental health and for some of these vulnerable populations. It's like taking a hammer into a glass shop and expecting a good result. However, there aren't many great options out there, and we're way better than we used to be at it. There used to be a time when I think the likelihood of force being used on somebody who is mentally ill was a lot higher than it is now. And so there's been training on recognizing signs of psychosis and being mentally distraught and having episodes that law enforcement is able to learn. Crisis intervention training is one just to throw out there that this agency, all of our officers go through crisis intervention training, which gives them not only signs and symptoms of mental disease, mental health issues, but they're trained from people who have mental health diagnoses on things that they experience, what helps sometimes and what doesn't help. I mean, the reality is in some of these cases, even the best officer just showing up in a uniform raises the anxiety level of some of the people that we go to see. So then we're behind the eight ball right from the get-go to try and work this into a non-use of force event, which is always the key. And then, so most of the time in these cases, a criminal act hasn't even taken place, but we're there as a precaution and to try and convince someone to get some medical treatment at the hospital, where then the other services like mental health professionals can come in and do evaluations. But man, there's so many factors in it that it's frustrating for law enforcement because we can get someone to the hospital and maybe they can't get the help that they need right then because they have co-disorders, like maybe not only do you have a mental health disorder, but you have a drug dependency as well. So the medical people have to make sure that what you're experiencing isn't a drug issue, that it's a mental health issue or a sobriety type issue where maybe they're intoxicated. And so they have to be clean from that before other areas can be addressed. In the meantime, if no criminal event has taken place and they're not involuntarily committed, they're able to leave. And we're called again because, the next time something happens. So,
are people not wanting to become officers in law enforcement right now? Because it doesn't sound that attractive of a thing to be in. This show is sponsored by PSF Legacy Jiu-Jitsu in Normal, Illinois. Jiu-Jitsu is the fastest growing martial art on the planet. It's such an amazing workout and it builds confidence like you would not believe. When you go to PSF Legacy Jiu-Jitsu in Normal, you will quickly learn how to take someone down, how to submit your opponent, and how to defend yourself on and off the mats. At PSF Legacy, you'll gain a sense of confidence that only comes from knowing that you can honestly defend yourself in the event of an attack or if you ever have to defend someone else. PSF Legacy Jiu-Jitsu's instructor is Jared Game, and he still competes in the National Jiu-Jitsu circuit. He's smart, patient, experienced, friendly, and tough as nails. The team is constantly growing here, and they're so warm and welcoming. So learn Jiu-Jitsu, get in shape, and gain confidence, and even make some friends, all at an unbeatable monthly price. Call or text PSF Legacy Jiu-Jitsu at 217-637-4699, or message them on Facebook at PSF Legacy Jiu-Jitsu. And be sure to tell them that the Paul Garcia Show sent you. And more is being expected without more and more pay and things like that.
Recruiting is definitely more difficult today than it was when I started. So, for example, when I started during the application and the testing process, my recruiting class had about 60 applicants that we were all fighting for 3 positions at that time. The last time we tested, we had 4 applicants.
No way.
Yeah. That was,
my gosh.
Yeah, last year. So, and now with the bill that has just been passed, I can't imagine that becoming any easier. Because like I said, there's some issues in that bill that have to be addressed. One of them, the biggest one is, well, there's a bunch of them. So there are some public safety issues in there, such as trespassing, and when people are no longer required to post bail. And, as a chief of police, I'm not necessarily opposed to changes in the bail structure, because I don't think it's fair that if you can't afford to bond yourself out, that you should have to sit in jail longer than somebody who has the monetary ability to do so.
It sounds like it's a way for the court or whoever really gets some money to just get some money. It's like, can you afford to get out? No, you can't. So sad. Stay in jail.
Yeah, so there are definitely some people who are able to bond out that maybe shouldn't be bonding out.
Exactly.
And based on risk is probably a better alternative, although I think there's going to be some problematic things with it where we're required to just issue a citation and release. And one of the examples in the bill is if someone is on your property and they refuse to leave, we would have to cite them and leave, and they're still on your property, and we can't make them leave because they're already automatically eligible for pretrial release. So there's some problematic things that the problem continues even after we've dealt with it. So, and hopefully the legislature is willing to look at some trailer bills and re-engage. And that's really been the problem, is that the law enforcement coalition has tried to engage the legislatures. They weren't interested. And so I know there's now trying to do public blame on both sides, from the law enforcement toward the legislatures and back. And all that silliness has to stop, and we have to just address on the focuses. The bill's been passed, and so now let's address the problems in the bill. The Body Camera Act, law enforcement, our officers would love to have body cameras all the time. Illinois statute makes it difficult, and I think now that it's required, we're going to face some more problems with it. The statute requires that anytime you're responding to a call, you have to have your body camera on. There's some exceptions that if your car camera is running at the time, you don't have to turn your body camera on until you get out of the car. But the problem with that is when you do that on every call, you're creating a lot of data, and that data costs money. And that data costs a lot of money. Yeah, because the body camera companies all are basically video as a service type companies, or storage as a service, where you're paying per terabyte, or and
if you're recording
their cloud
12 hours a day, that's going to add up pretty quick.
It's going to add up, and it's too expensive for a lot of agencies. So
I bet a lot of people don't know that you have to pay basically for the time that you're recording, so that recording more often is going to cost more money. And forget paying your officers anymore if you're going to have to
Right.
be paying. Like, the body cams thing sounds expensive.
It is very expensive. As a matter of fact, there were some agencies that had to get rid of them because it was going to bankrupt them. So
Could
it-
some
it's just too
close
expensive.
down because this will put them over? Is that possible?
You know, depending on what a city's financial situation is, I think it's going to be a big. I think it's going to be a big burden to a city like us. So right now, just as an estimate, the last time we looked at body cameras, we're talking about for their minimum storage, which isn't enough. Usually, the minimum is not enough to store what you're actually going to need per officer. So you basically need their middle tier, and we'd be looking at $10,000 to $15,000 a year just in storage of body cameras. Not to mention
Wow.
initial costs of getting the cameras and getting the servers, the software, and everything up and running. But the other part of the problem is now in the legislation, it made it a Class 3 felony for an officer to violate a body-worn camera policy. So Illinois statute, like I said, requires that an officer has the body camera turned on when they go to a call. If an officer, the example I use on that is I'm a block away from an incident and it's a significant incident. I have adrenaline. I have things going on. I get out of the car and I forget to turn on my body camera. I committed a felony.
And that you can get discharged or whatever, fired for that, right?
Yeah, you could be 3 to 5 years in prison for that.
Oh my!
So,
jeez.
Now, would a state's attorney prosecute you for a mistake that you made? Probably not. But the decertification process that the reform bill has made could surely decertify that officer. And we hope, I can't even say that I know, because we hope that the intention was for the officer who intentionally shut off his body camera and maybe either did something to a suspect or a citizen and then turned it back on after they did whatever corrupt act they were doing. We hope that that's the intent behind the Body Camera Act, but that's not what it says. And so we're just asking that the legislature be open to retool and redefine some of these things that's going to protect officers that make honest mistakes.
Yeah.
And we're talking about electronic technology. We've had car cameras for a long time in our cars from the days that we had big VHS machines mounted in between the two seats looking forward. And it always seems like there's that incident that you're like, oh, good, I had the video camera running and it digitally didn't work for whatever reason.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about it's at that time it was VHS, and then we moved into trying to write to DVDs while you're driving a car over railroad tracks. Not a good thing. And now we're writing, to hard drives, and on solid state drives is a lot easier to do, but it's still technology and it's still subject to failure.
And it costs money, of course.
And so when you do have a failure and it's on a significant incident, it looks pretty distrustful on the law enforcement part, like we did something or didn't, keep that video for a reason. But it is not uncommon for a video camera system to be in need of repair and out to service.
Yeah. All right. So, Jim, we've talked a lot about, it sounds crazy difficult to be an officer these days. I mean, a lot is expected of you, and it sounds very stressful. But I want to ask now, on a lighter note, what is the most rewarding or just simply the best part about being an officer, or maybe specifically being the chief of police here in Pontiac?
So, two things I'll address on that is it is difficult to be a police officer, but it's not impossible. So even though we have a reform bill and times have made law enforcement agencies do more with less, for example, when I started, there were 23 police officers here. We have 19 now as our full strength. We get the job done. We do it, and we do it professionally, and that's always going to be what law enforcement does. We'll always overcome whatever obstacles are in our way, and we'll do it the right way, and we'll work with the legislatures to get the right things in place for that to happen. And so we'll get through the reform bill. this isn't the end of law enforcement as we know it. And for those that are looking to get into the field, it is still a very rewarding field. I wouldn't change my career a bit because, asking me what the most rewarding parts of the job were on patrol, the freedom of the work is rewarding, but also those opportunities when you have a victim of a violent crime who gets to see justice because you were able to arrest an offender is a great thing. Being able to make partnerships with some of our social service groups in the community, our Safe Passage program, where we actually become an instrumental part in helping somebody get off heroin. What a rewarding thing. I'll tell you, in my career as a patrolman, I would have said I had never seen anyone get clean from heroin. Now, that's not true. I think what the reality is, those that got clean quit being police problems.
Yeah.
But, we've seen throughout our career people get addicted to heroin and drugs and eventually die from them repeatedly. And being part of this Safe Passage program where somebody can voluntarily just come here and say, look, I have a heroin problem, help me. And using our influence to get them into detox is a great thing. And to partner them up with, here in Livingston County, the Institute for Human Resources and their substance abuse program, it's an amazing thing. And it changes the perspective of a law enforcement officer from seeing people as incidents to seeing people as their name, as the people that they are, and finding that everyone has a value and has a worth. And I think that's probably the most important thing law enforcement can take in, is that if you're looking to get into law enforcement, we're people dealing with people. And so that's really what our goal is. We're part of the Livingston County Drug Court program. We've graduated a number now of people through that program that were heroin and other drug users that are now working great jobs, getting their lives back in order, visiting their kids, have custody of their kids, things that in law enforcement, unless you're part of it, normally you don't see that kind of stuff. We don't see the fruits of those programs. So it's a long, difficult process for a lot of these people, but it's good for police to see that, look, the shoes that they walk in aren't always easy to walk in. And so we get a whole new perspective. And I think it makes, when you get that call for the mentally ill person who this is your 13th time going to that call, to have compassion still, to be able to do the job safely and to respond appropriately when needed, but to also make sure that the end result is that person getting the help that they need. And being charged with resisting a peace officer offense just because, they lashed out at us while having a mental episode isn't always the best resolution for that. And
Right.
Our officers now recognize those things. And we have now for a number of years that everybody doesn't have to go to jail because of something, that may technically fit an offense when treatment or a hospital is a better option. So,
Yeah, that's really cool. Just one more question. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll ask it. So I know that you're a man of faith. Does that help you at all in this profession, or what does that do for you?
I think it, without a doubt, helps, because you have to understand that people are created in His image, right? And so everyone is entitled to the same dignity and the same respect that we're called to give each other. So, and so I think all the issues that we have with race and with orientation and just cultural differences, to me, in law enforcement, they're moot points, because if you look at people as through His image, that you can't help but to see them as somebody worth dignity and worth respect. And it's unconditional. I think, there's an old adage that you don't get respect until you deserve it. And I disagree with that. I think
Right.
You were given respect from birth, and everyone is entitled to unconditional respect. Now, we're not all trustworthy in our actions because we're fallible human beings, but you're at least worthy of my respect. And my respect may tell me that you're capable of wanting to kill me, but it also may tell me that you're somebody who needs some help right now. So,
Right.
And if you recognize that, you can make good decisions based off of that.
Wow. Well, Jim, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for keeping this community safe, and thank you so much for coming on to the show. It's been great.
So can I add one more thing?
Oh, of course you can.
Because you didn't ask me what the funniest incident I've had in my career is.
Let's hear it, yeah.
All right, so I'm just going to tell you real quick. One of the funniest things I've ever dealt with is we had a stolen car, and we found the stolen car abandoned in town, and when I opened up the door, lo and behold, the driver's license of the suspect was laying on the passenger floorboard. And so we were able to make an arrest because he left his license in the car that he stole. So those things happen even in small towns. So if it's the funniest thing you've ever seen on TV, it's probably actually happened.
Okay, well, what happened when you showed up to that person's door and you're like, hey, you left something?
Well, as in good typical fashion, they lied and said they weren't in there, and eventually were convicted of stealing the car.
That's hilarious. Thanks for telling that story. That was
Sure.
great. All right, Jim Woolford, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
My pleasure. That was great, man.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to The Paul Garcia Show. If you enjoy this show, and if you're watching on Facebook, please like and share this video. If you're on YouTube, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please consider leaving the show a 5-star rating and a review. This all helps out tremendously. If you want to support the show financially so that I can start doing some live episodes and multiple episodes each week, you can donate any dollar amount on Venmo or PayPal to, quote, The Paul Garcia Show, end quote. If you want to help support the show and gain access to bonus footage from and early access to each and every episode, then please become a patron on patreon.com/Paul Garcia for as little as $1 a month. Until next Sunday, I'm Paul Garcia. God bless and have a great week.